this joint JINSA Krulak Center event, the Jewish Institute of National Security of America, and the Brute Krulak Center for Innovation and Creativity, two outstanding organizations. I am Jeb Nadoner. I'm a vice president and fellow with JINSA. I also earlier was with the Krulak Center, and my pantheon stands Brute Krulak and the 31st Commandant. So I think it's fitting that we do an event on John Boyd. Major Ian Brown, who's currently at the Krulak Center, he researched and published a marvelous book on John Boyd that is available to everyone, PDF, care of the Marine Corps University Press. I encourage everyone to read it. I'm pleased to introduce him. Also today we're going to have Val Jackson, who's the spirited and brilliant director of the Krulak Center, having made it into what it is today. And then also my former colleague, friend and mentor, General John Tulin, today as well too. So with that beginning, I now turn it over to Director Jackson. You're on mute.
Sorry. Thanks, Jeb. What a privilege it is for the Krulak Center to share our operations officer, Major Ian Brown, with JINSA and the rest of the viewers out there. We understand that there are a lot of parallels between maneuver warfare and military innovation, so it's really no wonder that the Marine Corps has adopted John Boyd, as one of our favorites. We're just grateful to JINSA and to you, Jeb, for this collaboration, and we look forward to many future events. And so with that, I will introduce Major Ian Brown.
All right, thank you, ma'am. And my thanks as well to JINSA and Dr. Nadoner for helping to set this thing up. And it's definitely a great honor to be sharing a panel with Lieutenant General Tulin here with us. I'm very excited to bring you today just kind of a small snippet from the book. I could talk about this personally for hours because it's been becoming a passion project of mine. But what I'm going to take a little bit of time is drilling down into the formation and the ideas that came out of that formation of the mind of Colonel John Boyd, who was a retired Air Force colonel, and throughout the late 1970s and 1980s had a significant influence on the Marine Corps as the Marine Corps itself was going through what General Van Riper called an intellectual renaissance. The Marine Corps, like all the armed services, had come out of the Vietnam War dissatisfied with its performance, feeling like they didn't get the win at the end of the day on that battlefield. And in the years that followed, across the DoD, all the different services were looking at different ways of how, when the next fight comes, to make sure that that didn't happen, and what they would have to do as institutions to make sure that they would go out to those battlefields and get the win to achieve America's national security interest, to do what they are supposed to do in defending the United States and its interests. And the way the Marine Corps kind of approached that, it was interesting. The different services all had different flavors, but the Marine Corps approached it less from a perspective of stuff in terms of material changes or table of organizational changes, although that was a large part of it. They were looking at some sort of overarching concept that could tie all the stuff, the TOs, the weapons, the people, the training, tie it all together in a cohesive whole with a cohesive vision that was driving it forward, regardless of the circumstances that the Marine Corps might be called to respond to. And it was important that this philosophy was something that could be tailored to any potential battlefield, because the Marine Corps, as the nation's first responder force, the first ones in with their MAGTAFs, their Marine Air Ground Task Force, tailored in different levels. But if something happened, they were supposed to be the first ones to go in there. They would have, they don't get to pick their adversary. So you need a way of thinking about conflict that will let you succeed against any adversary, regardless of whether they are another group of insurgents running through Southeast Asian jungles or large, modern, well-armed, mechanized, armored, near-peer adversary military. So like I said, I could talk about that for hours, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the ideas that the Marine Corps eventually latched onto, that they wove into that philosophy that allowed them, that gave them a ultimate theory called maneuver warfare, which is the doctrinal concept that was adopted officially in 1989 and is still the capstone concept for how the Marine Corps employs itself today. So I'm going to switch over to my my screen sharing here, and we'll get started. And Dr. Nadar, you can just confirm that you're seeing my screen.
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. So I took this from the content of my book, A New Conception of War, published by Marine Corps University Press back late 2018. All the stuff you see on the screen here, like I said, it's been hours, but we're really going to focus in on John Boyd as a thinker, as a innovator, and as someone who made a unique contribution to how both the Marine Corps thinks about conflict today, and along with other very significant contributions that are still impacting our national defense thoughts today. So going back to John Boyd, all the way back to 1927, he was born 23 January in Erie, Pennsylvania. He was a child of the Great Depression, and his experience during the Great Depression, I mean, very similar to others who grew up during that time frame. He just sort of took it to, he sort of firewalled that experience and those personality traits. He grew up developing a fierce desire to operate on his own, doing things his own way, and an equally fierce determination to maximize his own self-improvement and deliver useful products to repay this independence. And these are two things that, for better or for worse, would sort of define him throughout his professional career and his time after the Air Force. So he flew the F-86 Sabre fighter aircraft in Korea during the Korean War. He did not accrue enough hours to become a flight lead, but he was struck by a contrast in performance between the Americans' F-86 Sabre and the Soviet equivalent, the MiG-15. And this is a data point that stuck with him throughout in his professional career. We'll revisit it later in a little bit. After Korea, he was good enough of a pilot. He became an F-86 instructor pilot and got invited as an instructor to the Fighter Weapons School, which is the Air Force's version of Top Gun, for those who aren't familiar. And this experience of Fighter Weapons School imprinted the second data point that helped define him. This was, he didn't like the tactics curriculum they were teaching. He felt it was very rote memorization, sort of be quiet and do what I tell you and don't think about it. So he changed the tactics curriculum to get at the why behind specific maneuvers, why a maneuver worked in this case and didn't. And this exchanged the previous checklist style approach to problem solving with first developing a new conceptual mental framework for exploring that problem, and then building a repository of knowledge and experience from which one could then draw any number of solutions mixed and matched to the situation, depending on the unique nature of the problem you were facing. And in the top right-hand corner there, that's a literal visual depiction of how he started building that framework for air-to-air combat. This is from his tactics manual called the Aerial Attack Study, where before he went into any maneuvers, he described a three-dimensional time space that aircraft operated in to set the stage for talking about the maneuvers. So he had a successful tenure there. In 1959, he was selected to the Air Force Institute of Technology program through Georgia Tech. And at Georgia Tech, he kind of had his next big breakthrough, which was developing a theory that would completely change how the United States approached both aircraft acquisitions and fighter tactics. So in the best scientific tradition, this happened accidentally. He was talking about thermodynamics with some fellow civilian students. And for anyone who's been in the military, talking to a non-military audience, he was trying to find a way to explain aircraft tactics in a way that his non-military counterparts could understand. And because they were all engineering students, he framed this by talking about maneuvers as changes in energy states, changes shifting between potential energy and kinetic energy and back again. And as he was talking about this, he felt that, to him, this seemed like a huge revelation, that a framing of fighter tactics and energy changes that no one had thought of before. He was convinced that he was not the first one to think about it this way, but in his research, he found that no one had approached the problem of fighter tactics this way, so he started doing it himself. He he collected data over the course of several years to the point where he finally codified his ideas in something called the energy maneuverability theory. And the equation for that is in the center of the screen there. It's all those letters in the fraction. The short version of what the EM theory lets you do was let you do two things. You could calculate an aircraft's existing performance based on its design characteristics. And conversely, you could design an aircraft if you wanted it to perform in a certain way based on this calculation. You could maximize its performance in desired areas based off the calculation. And of note, the underlying theory of energy maneuverability is very much a part of military aviation today. On the far bottom right corner there, you have looks like a lot of red and blue lines, but that's energy maneuverability chart, which I think this one is taken from an old F4 tactics manual. But these charts are still in our tactics manuals today to help you overlay your performance against potential adversary performance and compare the strengths and weaknesses, the strengths where you want to go and the weaknesses where you don't want to go, and vice versa. So he has this theory, and he would move on to apply it to the actual development of real physical airframes. He applied it in both the development of the F-15 Eagle aircraft, which you see in the bottom left corner there. He kind of applied the theory to a pre-existing program that was really, really struggling, and he turned that program around, made the aircraft a lot more efficient, less expensive, and that's the F-15 Eagle aircraft that we still have today. And he also managed to apply it in an aircraft built from the ground up to achieve the performance purity that he saw in the EM theory. And this was the F-16 aircraft, which you also see in the picture there in the lower left corner. Now, so he's built a theory, he's helped design two fighter aircraft. These are already fairly significant contributions to national defense. But in the course of the test flights of the F-16 against its test counterpart, which was designated as the YF-17 test aircraft and would actually go on to become the Navy's F-18 Hornet aircraft. In the course of the fly-off between those two, he was first introduced to an idea he later called fast transients, or aircraft maneuvers that involved rapid changes between energy states. And he found in these flight tests that you could generate advantageous mismatches by having a more agile aircraft against a less agile opponent. And he would take this data point along with the other ones he had collected in his brain with him down the road to start influencing broader ideas about warfighting and conflict. So up to this point, he's had a fairly remarkable career as an Air Force officer. But going back to that desire to do things his own way, he had a very strong personality, to be a charitable way of saying it, but he had no problem telling people what he thought, and especially if he thought that they were wrong, if they refused to accept new information and change their perspective. And he applied this theory to people of equal or higher rank, which didn't make him a lot of friends. So he eventually, in 1975, retires as a colonel in the Air Force, feeling that he has been constrained by bureaucratic infighting, and that to sort of break free and explore some of these ideas in more detail, he needs to get away from the institution and have the freedom to go where he wants to. So he retires, but he's not done yet. His retirement meant he could now turn to a serious study of the many things that have been floating around inside his head during his time in uniform. These are things like the underlying purpose behind those fighter maneuver mechanics, the rejection of checklist-based rigidity in favor of assessing and deciding based on circumstance, new conceptual frameworks for thinking, mismatches generated by the fast transients he saw in the flight tests, and how all of these things interacted and combined in the broader realm of competition and survival. So he starts doing this in an essay called Destruction and Creation. And this essay was really sort of the first step that formed the underlying foundation, both for his many different explorations of conflict theory, as well as the foundation for the maneuver warfare theory the Marine Corps still uses today. So going into, sorry, apparently we lost my screen here, 1 second. Okay, Dr. Nadar, do you have me back up?
Yes, we've got you. Good.
Okay, great. Did I leave off at destruction and creation?
You're, I think, in the right place right now.
Okay, all right, fantastic. Okay, so this essay, Destruction and Creation, if it first took as its base assumption that all human activity is shaped by the goal of ensuring survival on your own terms. And in order to survive, this requires a constant cycle of decision making and action based on those decisions. But the only way to make decisions that truly contribute to your survival is to make sure your perception of reality is as closely matched to the actual and constantly changing reality around you as possible. This means that you have to constantly build and rebuild your own perceptions and then assess the outcomes of those perceptions. He merged three seemingly unrelated concepts from math and physics to explain this process, and I've highlighted them on the screen there in the top left. So first he took Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which says that you can't determine the true nature of a system from within inside the system. And then on top of that, he layered on Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and the second law of thermodynamics, so that any attempt to understand a system from inside itself only increases the uncertainty and disorder within that system, pushing it farther away from the reality that's external to it. So what does this all mean? So his point was, if you're making decisions based on a closed system and you're not understanding that, your action may not match what reality really requires for your own survival. This thus makes any decisions based on that false perception potentially self-destructive, which is a very dangerous divergence between reality and perception. So he said you have to constantly build up and break down the information around you, constantly incorporate new information to keep pace with the changes that are actually going on around you. So this was his framework for thinking about survival and human conflict. It was an abstract framework, and so he took it and started looking back to see if there was real world data to support this idea. And he believed that he found those evidence, and there were a couple of other points from his career that helped sort of build up the evidentiary standard for what he thought was this idea. The first was the fly-off between the F-16 and F-17 we talked about before. There's actually a color picture there of both those aircraft in the bottom middle of the screen. So after the fly-off, the test pilots almost all said that the F-16 was a better aircraft in all regimes. And this didn't make sense based on the EM calculations that he had done on both aircraft, which suggested that the YF-17 should have been better under certain circumstances. And so Boyd found it was interesting that his own equation was wrong in the application, and he dug into finding out why. He determined that the F-16's thrust to weight ratio allowed it to shed and regain energy a lot more quickly. And what this means is it was not necessarily a faster or more maneuverable aircraft in an absolute sense, but it could transition between its maneuvers a lot more rapidly than the F-17 could. And this was partly because this was the first aircraft to have a fly-by-wire electronic flight control system, which meant you could input your maneuvers at the speed of a computer rather than at the speed of a hydraulic mixing unit that translated your movements to the control surfaces. So these are the things that he called the fast transients, and this is what allowed those F-16 pilots to repeatedly create advantageous mismatches against the less responsive YF-17. The second real-world experience that started giving him this data was collaboration he did on development of the A-10. He was brought on to help work through some of the EM application, but in the course of building the A-10, he happened to interview a lot of old German Luftwaffe pilots from World War II, because the Luftwaffe had specifically designed aircraft for close air support, which is what the A-10 was doing. So the US military wanted to capture or explore the lessons they had learned. These interviews led Boyd into a deeper examination of German tactics and strategy during World War II, especially the early Blitzkrieg years. And then this in turn led Boyd into a much deeper and broader study of military history, all the way back through the time of Sun Tzu in the Chinese warring states, to see if there were any constants, or what he called patterns, in what strategies made history's most successful commanders so successful. So Boyd had his theory in destruction and creation, and using his own mental laboratory, he was plugging in all the lessons, the real world lessons from military history. And the output of all of this was a briefing that he called Patterns of Conflict. You can see an excerpt from that in the top right of the screen. Patterns of Conflict was the real venue that let Boyd have his influence across the Marine Corps, because he presented this time and time again to various Marine Corps audiences, and they latched on to the underlying concepts. So what Patterns of Conflict did, and why it was attractive to the Marine Corps, was that it flipped around that dangerous divergence I talked about earlier. In Destruction and Creation, that theory allowed you to recognize how dangerous that divergence was for your own survival. So in Patterns of Conflict, Boyd flips it around to look at how different commanders and armies had imposed and exploited this divergence on their adversaries. And to kind of summarize his perspective on this application of warfare, he called it a, quote, new conception for waging war. And I'm going to give an extensive quote. This sort of encapsulates the concept he was trying to get across in Patterns of Conflict. Quote, the whole point is to generate a rapidly changing environment, quick, clear observations, fast tempo, fast transients, quick kill. Or you can turn it around the other way to inhibit an adversary's capacity to adapt to such an environment. Suppress or distort his observation by suppressing or distorting your signatures. Always try to remain somewhat inconspicuous, at least more inconspicuous than he is. Unstructure your adversary's system into a hodgepodge of confusion and disorder, thus causing him to under or overreact to your activity, which appears uncertain, ambiguous, and chaotic to him. So this is a remarkable concept, and one thing that it seems to require is an almost unnatural degree of prescience and internal cohesion on the friendly side to execute. But Boyd said that this was nevertheless possible if you leveraged, if your own side leveraged two other ideas, which he explores in Patterns of Conflict. The first one is a German term, which I'm probably going to butcher here, but it's called Fingerspitzengefühl, which literally translates as fingertip feeling. This term describes an intuitive ability to look at a given situation, immediately grasp the essentials, and rapidly act. Similar to discarding the checklist mentality of air-to-air combat, you could develop this skill in your own people by giving them constant and repeated hands-on experience under a variety of conditions to build a repertoire of responses and inculcate decision-making and action as a habit. And in order to execute this, the next thing you need was a deceptively element, but it's trust. You have to trust your people to go out and gain the experience in which you can develop that Fingerspitzengefühl, so that when the time comes, that trust and that intuitive feeling acts almost as a nonverbal form of communication, where you know what your people are going to do. You know how your strong commanders will respond, how your weak commanders will respond, and you can organize yourselves accordingly and put your strengths against your adversary's weaknesses. So this is what you do on your side. You develop those abilities, and then to flip it around, you want to unglue all those things in your adversary. You want to break up those bonds of trust, those bonds of intuitive communication, in order to destroy the cohesion of your adversary and make him spin off into what Boyd called non-cooperating centers of gravity. He could still have centers of strength, but they wouldn't be able to communicate or organically interact with each other, and so you could turn that to your advantage. And so getting to the end of this discussion here, one thing that Boyd sort of harped on is that this discussion didn't require any precondition in specific technology or terrain on battlefields or any other specific aspect of the physical or material realms. It focused on the human element, your human element for your side and that of your adversary, which would be the one continuity on every battlefield. And so you can see how this approach to conflict could appeal to the Marine Corps, which in the 1970s, 1980s was looking at everything from insurgencies, again, in Southeast Asia or in the African subcontinent or sub-Saharan Africa, all the way up to a resurgent Soviet Union, which was about as highly mechanized, had significant material advantages in terms of manpower, armor, firepower. But if that conflict came up, the Marine Corps couldn't say no to it.
Very good.
Okay.
Major
and
Blue.
with that,
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I'm going to now turn to General Tulin for some comments. You're on mute, sir.
All right, thank you very much. Some people in the audience might be assuming, why is Tulin involved in the conversation on physics and calculus? And obviously I can't even turn on my mute button. So, what am I doing here? But I think the perspective that Ian gives is very good insights into Boyd. But I thought, with my experience, not only on active duty in the Marine Corps, but more importantly now, and having the opportunity to spend time at the Marine Corps University, Command and Staff College, exercises, and also getting out into the operating forces and actually seeing what we're doing, I think is kind of giving me some perspective. I'm also believe that I'm also the guardian of, the concept of maneuver warfare. When we talk about General Gray and back in his early days in the late 1980s, a strong proponent of maneuver warfare, he's found oftentimes that when we talk maneuver warfare, that terminology and that philosophy comes under siege a bit by people who believe that we're not really capturing the warfighting philosophy that we need in our current time. I believe truly that we're at an inflection point right now, and that what we do and how we respond to the National Defense Strategy that came out in 2018 is going to be very important. Our Commandant, General Berger, has come out with the Commandant's planning guidance. Now it's almost a year old, and it's an excellent, description of what we need to do at this inflection point in order to follow through on our national defense security strategy. The fact that we even have a national defense strategy is a big plus, because even from my experience of working in this Office of Secretary of Defense and other places, we have oftentimes not had that strategy out in time, and so we're always playing catch up. But in 2018, we turned out the National Defense Strategy, and we've actually been following it closely. General Berger in the Marine Corps has, I think, really taken a very active role in trying to take what the Marine Corps is doing and making sure that we are actually meeting that strategy. And so the NDS has really done a couple of big things. One is it's identified a region of the world, PACOM, as an area of interest for the Marine Corps, an area really to get more familiar with. And he talks about the great powers competition. And one of the challenges that we have when we talk about great powers competition is that oftentimes we think great powers competition, we think large conventional fighting, large conventional warfare. And I think that's a misnomer, because the reality is that really in great powers competition, what we're finding more and more is that there are some new rules out there that are really going to change and should change the way we fight, the way we approach fighting. We have in several exercises, and I just finished an exercise last week at Command and Staff College, where the students took a good hard look at what a joint task force with a Marine Expeditionary Force as part of that task force can do when it gets inside the Pacific Theater, and how it actually works its way through the threat areas, et cetera, to get to where they need to go. But the fact is that the rules have changed, and the rules-based order is really changed. There's a book out by an individual named Sean McPate, which I highly encourage people to read, that talks about these new rules of war. And the fact is that these new rules of war are fundamentally very difficult for the Marine Corps and for the United States of America to really engage in. Yet, if we don't adjust the way we fight and adjust the way we think, and take into account that rules are not going to be followed, and that the enemy, particularly those larger countries such as Russia and China and Iran, with their proxy forces, are using them in violation of those rules to get after the United States of America, to get after our moral authority, to get after our economic power, etc. And then you take into account the other aspects of what we're contending with currently in the Pacific. The competition, the great powers competition, is not necessarily conventional armies and conventional fighting. It's actually how much money is being spent by those countries in order to influence and increase their their influence in that particular region. So, we have the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a huge investment by China, which is taking a lot of projects throughout the region, in and outside of the Pacific, and trying to win influence and win support from those countries that are getting loans for port facilities, airfields, etc. And the question is, are we preparing and are we setting up the stages properly so that we can actually fight in that environment, that we can operate in that economic environment? We need to be able to kind of take a couple of those initiatives that our Chinese friends are having in the Pacific and start working them ourselves. So the bottom line is the great powers competition is real, but it's not necessarily a conventional fight. And so what we need to do, in using our maneuverist philosophy at our heart, is to use the maneuverist philosophy in areas outside of just conventional fighting. Maybe we need to start thinking, and I recommend again McPate's book, we think about how we could impact on our adversaries, but doing it at the lower end of the conflict spectrum. Doing it in the gray areas. When we talk about the gray areas and how effective and competent we are, and to be quite honest, we don't do a very good job in working in the margins and going after things that are the lower end but can be very valuable as far as winning influence. So I'll stop there for now, just to kind of highlight again that the great powers competition, yes, it is real, but it's not necessarily implies conventional thinking. And what we have to do as maneuver theorists, as war fighters in maneuver warfare, is think about ways we can influence the action without actually going to that large scale fight. So I'll stop there and hopefully we'll get some good questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, General Tulin. I want to acknowledge we've got a lot of very great American patriots that are on this call. The list is really almost too long to go through. But I think I want to offer the first question to another thinker that is, I think there are several American thinkers that we know in the PME community and the defense enterprise, but I think could deserve far greater exploration in the wider U.S. society and business community. One of them is General Van Riper, who's on the line, and I'd like to offer him a chance to make a comment. General Van Riper, we cannot hear you. Okay, while we work that out, we also have Professor Eric Clemens.
Can you hear me now?
From the Wharton School? Oh, yes, we can, General Van Riper.
Okay. There were two unmutes. I wasn't sure which one I had to push.
Very good, sir.
I just sent the chat question in. This strays a little bit from Ian Brown's book, but it goes back to what General Tulin's been saying. We know that we have a national security strategy, and that really was the first one came out during the Reagan administration. Prior to that, to determine what the national security strategy was like reading tea leaves. You had to look at the presidential State of the Union speech, a lot of different documents, and then try to determine if you were in the Pentagon what it might be. So the first national security strategy was a welcome relief, both to those of us in PME who had to teach the process, but also to those who had the design of forces. Other than the second one, I don't believe there's been useful national security strategy since. But from that originally flowed the national military strategy, and then under Secretary Rumsfeld, we had the national defense strategy. So these flow, but they are required by legislation to be replaced with a new one with every administration. So if the commandant's going to build a force based on those documents, that is going to be temporary, and very well, those documents could disappear come January 2021. During the Cold War, it was different. We had a grand strategy, and that grand strategy was enduring and flowed from NSC 68. So if the nation doesn't have a grand strategy and your force design is based on a document that's changed every 4 years, we might have a problem in the future.
That's a very valuable point. Major Brown, do you have a reaction to that?
I mean, yeah, first of all, General Van Riper, I didn't know you were going to be on here. It's great to get a chance to talk to you again, and I will call you this week. I did get your email. Yeah, I think the difference between a sort of transient strategies going between different administrations versus sort of an enduring overarching thing, I think that's something that Boyd actually touched on a little bit, kind of in the less well-known parts of his ideas, but he nested his, sort of the very tactical or operational level, going in and going after adversary forces. That was actually nested under sort of a hierarchy of thought, and the top hierarchy was you need some sort of overarching, enduring strategy to, as General Toland said, to while you're below the level of kinetic, your strategy is still there, achieving national goals for you. And Boyd called that, I think he called that, quote, the grand ideal. And it was essentially a articulation, and then through your various uses of national power, your soft power, the D, the I, and the E, and the things outside the military, those all had to be nested inside that grand ideal so that they were constantly promoting your interests, your values, binding you to your allies and your friends, and then also acting kind of as a permanent wedge against your adversaries. They have their own grand ideal too that they're trying to achieve in that threshold below conflict. And you really need to focus on having a coherent and an enduring grand ideal, overarching national vision that is driving after your interest when you're not fighting around the battlefield. And that's kind of what, like General Toland said, what NSC 68 did for such a long period of time was that was the thing that was driving all the elements of American power when, we didn't want to fight World War III. We wanted to keep it below that threshold. And the elements of NSC 68 were what did it. And I actually did, several years back, I did kind of a deeper dive into some different American national strategy documents, starting with NSC 68. And for anybody who hasn't read it, I would say go and read it and find it. What really struck me about it is that this was a classified document, highly classified, only seen by a very small handful of people in the inner circle of the American government. But you read through it, and it is this very detailed, articulate vision of what America stood for, what we thought was good about us, and then it laid out against the Soviet bloc and the Soviet vision why this was not good. All the bad things that we thought they were trying to do in terms of overturning national determination, aggressive expansion, and it laid out this vision, really contrasting the two sides, and then it said, this is why America deserves to win this conflict, and we need to spread this message in all the elements of our national power outside the military. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that, I think the historical evidence was that overarching vision helped drive through multiple administrations through the Cold War. And ultimately, there was only one person left standing at the end of that. And it was because we had a coherent vision that we tried to follow for many, many, many years, and see it through until our opponent could no longer sustain their own vision. It's not to say that we were not always perfect by any means in executing that vision, but that vision, knowing what we stood for, was a weapon in and of itself. so that we never had to employ the full might of the M in the D in the dime.
Thank you, Major Brown. I'd like to give Professor Clemens a chance to talk.
I've unmuted once. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, sir.
Okay, great. First, General Tulin, thanks for the plug. You plugged the book just before the workshop started. I'm overwhelmed with difficulty that all flag rank officers face today, and that is functioning in a world which is uncertain in two ways. This is more of a statement of my concern and a request for guidance than anything else. For decades, possibly centuries, we've mostly functioned in a world which I call sort of post-Westphalian. We understand that there are formal armies. We understand that there are non-combatants. We understand that there are differences. We understand that there are legitimate uses of force, but elimination of a nation is not one of them. We had an aberrant period during World War II, but mostly the West has observed some principles simply because the cost of the 30 Years' War was so high. As General Tulin points out, the Chinese in particular were never part of this agreement, nor was the Islamic world. And the US functions under sets of rules which I think are morally justifiable, but I don't know how a military plans when these rules are no longer followed. And I don't know how you function when both doctrine and national grand strategy are as fluid as they are today. I mean, as the Major points out, we had a set of beliefs, and the fact that we had a set of beliefs made us morally superior. And the absence of a coherent strategy, the absence of a set of beliefs, doctrine, if you will, I don't know how the military functions. And as the Major points out, we may have a new doctrine, we may have a new strategy in 6 months, or we may continue to have none. So General Tulin, perhaps you can explain to me how we function at all.
Can I come back to that one, Jeb?
Yes, please, General Tulin.
Professor Clemens, I'm really glad you made it today, and you bring up some great points. And of course, General Van Riper, my mentor from many years ago as well, reminds me that we don't have a grand strategy. And I think the challenge for us is the fact that, you just take, for example, Moore's law. Technology is advancing at rates that we really can't even absorb to ourselves how fast things are moving. And so you wonder if technology is moving so quickly, will we ever really come up with a grand strategy? Will we ever really have something that will stand the test of time? And I would just offer that what will stand the test of time are our values. It's our moral standard. It's the fact that we are going to be that beacon that's going to represent what's good about America. And through that, draw the support, and the trust, and the confidence of the rest of the world. I mean, the world is shrinking, right? I mean, it's more and more global. And so that little butterfly that's flitting its wings in Singapore is, creating thunderstorms in Africa. I mean, that's the way the world is today. And I think having a grand strategy is going to be a very difficult concept just because of our political structure. But I do think if we stand on moral values, I think they'll give us the respect that we need and the attention to kind of bring the world into a peaceful, stable environment.
Thank you, General Tulin. I'd like to turn the mic over next to General Dana, who's got a very good question, one that's has occupied quite a bit of time at the both in Washington and the Marine Corps University and the larger Defense Department. General Dana.
Well, I hope you can hear me because I'm a baby boomer, so anytime with technology, it gets problematic. But great to see General Tulin. Hello, sir. And Major Brown, great work. Both of you, great briefs. My question is, if Boyd were alive today and he saw to get to General Toolan's point, if he saw the advancements in technology, specifically artificial intelligence, and we have a sensor-laden battlefield like we've never had before, and precision fires that are orders of magnitude more effective than in the past. And then in that sensor-laden environment, if you're able to collect, analyze that information with machine help, does it turn Boyd on his head, so to speak? And just while you're thinking of that, I'd recommend that you read about a German general. It's always a German general, you know, with maneuver warfare, but Balk, B-A-L-C-K, Hermann Balk. And he's literally like 9-0 in World War II. The guy never loses. Because to your earlier point, Major Brown, he's always got the fingertips on the battle, and he literally beats the Russians each and every time when he's outnumbered 10-1, 9-1. I mean, every time, because he's got that sensing for the battlefield. So my question is, if today you gave the Russian corps commander outside of Stalingrad machine learning capability and AI in a sensor-laden battlefield, would he beat the German? Would he beat Balk? And that's kind of a rhetorical point, but just, I think things are the warfare isn't going to change. I think machine learning and AI will impact how we do decision-making, planning, and all aspects of that. So interested in feedback on that one. And thanks for letting me talk.
Thank you, General Dana. I just would make reference also, General Allen, who's now at Brookings. He came out with a volume, an edited volume called Hyperwar. And he speaks about the challenges of AI and machine learning essentially collapsing the OODA loop. It's a very difficult concept to think through. Major Brown or General Toolan, any reactions to what General Dana said?
Yeah, I'll sort of there, General Dana. That's a great question, and in fact, I'll put a plug in for a class that's offered right now by the College of Distance Education and Training continuing education program called Beyond Boyd, which in the last module it actually examines that very question. You know, Boyd was great. We had maneuver warfare, but it was the last time, you know, we sort of revised the concepts of maneuver warfare was in 1997 when we turned FM-FM1 into MCDP1, and that was before, you know, the information age. That was before everybody had 5 different mobile devices in their home. Before we really talked about applying artificial intelligence, machine learning to the battlefield. You know, before we had to think about, you know, autonomous, you know, drones or subsurface ships, what have you, potentially computers making decisions without humans doing it. So that last module kind of asked the question, is maneuver warfare and Boyd's ideas still viable in this new environment? And I would argue yes, because all these new things, they certainly didn't exist in the form that they do now back when Boyd was still alive and giving his classes. But the core thrust of Boyd's ideas and the thrust of maneuver warfare is that your object at the end of whatever the technology or the terrain or the, you know, the table of organization you're facing, at the end of that chain is a human adversary or adversaries who you're trying to influence, who you're trying to wreck their decision-making cycle, who you're trying to, you know, undermine their moral cohesion, their willpower. And I think you can argue that these new things, those are simply new vectors to an old objective. You know, it's facing an adversary who's got a supercomputer helping them crunch data and make decisions is a challenge. But that supercomputer and the interpretation of that data can be influenced. And at the end of the day, unless you completely turn your battlefield over to a fully autonomous AI force that literally thinks differently than human beings, that may be a different story. But as long as there's a human being at the end of the technology chain, all those different things, those drones, that AI, that machine learning, those are all vectors and opportunities to get to them and influence their thinking. You know, if you know your adversary is very dependent on big data crunching and data interpretation, I want to go after that data. I want to corrupt that data because that's become a crutch for my adversary. And if I know that they are relying very heavily on that, that's a new way for me to get to him or her and influence their decision-making, corrupt their decision-making, and get them to make decisions that are not suited to their own survival. So I think we do need to start looking at how we apply our philosophy to all of these new vectors. But I think they're vectors to an old objective, and I think Boyd would look at them all as new avenues of opportunity as much as anything else.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. I wanted one last question. I'm going to throw that to Sean Callahan for Ian Brown, and then we will. I'll have a few closing comments, and so will General Bargeron as well too.
Okay, Jeb. Hi, this is Sean Callahan. I guess you want me to just read off my question?
Please.
Okay. Thank you very much, gentlemen. This has been a great talk. I just was inspired by the title of the talk to ask a question. The title identifies John Boyd as the greatest strategist you never heard of. And certainly the conversation already, I think, has brought out some really important and novel ideas that he introduced, such as the ideal or the grand ideal. You know, frankly, I think with all the division happening in America today and the the fact that we have different visions of the grand ideal is perhaps proof positive of the wisdom that Boyd had. My question goes to the nature of what his contribution is. When I think of somebody being a strategist, I think of somebody who applies theory or other ideas, concepts to make strategy. But I'm not sure that Boyd ever really advocated a particular strategy regarding the problems that the United States faced at the time vis-a-vis the rest of the world and perhaps in a more global sense. So was he a strategist or was he a strategic theorist who gave us a new way of thinking about strategy?
If I can make a quick point, Sean, good to hear from you. I'm going to shamelessly borrow something that I got from my one of my master's advisors, Dr. Charles Oliviero, who he's a big Boyd fan. He's a retired colonel in the Canadian military, but he was a big influence when I started doing the research that led to this book. And he kind of laid out a tiered approach to different levels of thinking, all the way from like philosophy down to TTPs. And I think in that hierarchy, Boyd is above the level of a pure strategist and could arguably be above the level of a theorist. Because in Dr. Oliviero's hierarchy, philosophy is a enduring framework of thought that sort of drives your every action and influences every decision, regardless of whether it's your day job or how you interact with your family or your society as a whole. And I think General Gray sort of touches on that when he called maneuver warfare his philosophy for warfighting. You know, we looked at it as we took MCDP1 as a manual to go off and fight on tactical and operational and strategic level battlefields. But that key point that General Gray made as a philosophy, that it's something you apply in garrison as well as in the field, I think kind of elevates Boyd above. He had a strategic eye, but I think he was operating at a level beyond what we would call a strategist in terms of applying certain ideas only on a physical battle space.
Thank you very much, Major Brown. I want to turn for closing comments to General Bargeron, who's the president of Marine Corps University. Can you hear us, sir? We cannot hear you.
Good afternoon, all. This is Captain Straw, Brigadier General Bargeron's aide. He had to step away from the phone for a couple minutes, so will not be available for closing comments.
Okay. And we've got a few minutes left. I see General Van Riper's got a raised hand. I want to give him the final question, and then we will close out.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Two observations. One, decision-making always comes down not to the amount of information, but to the seeing a pattern. Its pattern recognition is key. In fact, that's the very essence of decision-making. So you can be overloaded with information, but if you don't detect the pattern, you're not going to be able to make decisions. Going on to strategy, I I was with the, when we looked back at the strategy in 2010, we had the group that had to do it, recognized that the strategy wasn't up, but in order to proceed with examining what was going to happen with the defense guidance, we decided to look back over 100 years and see what was it America actually did, not what it said, but what it actually did. And from that deduced what really was a grand strategy that endured for more than 100 years. I'll send that to Major Brown and you can distribute it if you want, because I always thought that was the only real way you're going to get at the essence of what the country is about.
Thank you, sir. Val Jackson, do you have any closing comments?
Thanks, Jeb. None other than to say that I think this is a tremendously productive talk. And once again, I appreciate everybody tuning into this very important event, very important discussion topic for this day and age. And in this format, I think it speaks volumes to, the importance of maintaining this type of collaboration between organizations such as GINSA and the Marine Corps. Thanks for putting this together.
Thank you, Colonel Jackson. I want to encourage everyone to read Major Brown's book. We've just covered just the surface of it. There's some very deep ideas. Perhaps my favorite section of the book is where Major Brown focuses on Boyd's spotlight on cohesion, undermining an enemy's cohesion. And when you begin to think about strategy in that way, it begins to look very different, whether it's military strategy or grand strategy vis-a-vis a competing great power. So I encourage everyone to do that. I thank our friends in the Marine Corps. I thank our friends in GINSA. And this has been an excellent session. General Tulin, thank you for being one of the sponsors of this. And hopefully this will be one of several events we do with the Krulak Center.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again for the opportunity.
Very good. Until next time.